Well, thank you all for being here tonight. I am very honored and touched to receive this award. It's a very significant award, and I know several of the people who have received it, and to receive an award named for David Fairchild Plant Exploration is really special. So it's difficult to cover 40 plus years in 20 minutes. So I'm going to give you a taste of my travels and my work exploring breadfruit. And every slide that I show you could represent a 20-minute presentation. So this is one of the many Pacific Islands I got to visit. My work did not start in the Pacific Islands. My work started in a library. I knew nothing about breadfruit in 1983. I was working on a master's degree in horticulture and decided to take a class on French Polynesia to learn more about it. And I decided to write a paper on something called breadfruit. So I spent a lot of time in the library, and this I found in my files is that paper I wrote for a class in 1983. And what I read about breadfruit in these surveys and these historical accounts just compelled me to do it, to go out in the Pacific and study breadfruit. And I read things written in the 1920s about how important breadfruit was. Nobody really knew how many varieties there were. I read the same thing written after World War II. And I was compelled. It's like, this is what I'm going to do. I had no funding. I had no intention of doing a PhD, but this was something that just called on me. So I didn't have a private patron like David Fairchild's patron on Armour and his yacht. I didn't have a royal commission from King George to go out on the Bounty or the Providence. I had a passion and I had a commitment to do it. So I figured out a way to go to a breadfruit culture. I went to Western Samoa. I went for a year. I gave up my house in Honolulu. I managed to get some funding to go. And I went to a place where breadfruit is an integral part of the culture. And you can see breadfruit trees are in every yard, in the village, it's everywhere. But I didn't go there to study breadfruit. That was a kind of side thing I was allowed to do. I went there to work as a crop researcher growing tomatoes and onions, figuring out which one would be best for the Samoan climate. But I also went because there was in my reading a breadfruit collection that had been put together in the 50s, and there was very little information about it. So I went there to see if I could figure out about this breadfruit collection. And it was at the Prime Minister's home by Lima, which was also, before that, the home of Robert Louis Stevenson. And you can see the coconut trees, but that was the abandoned collection. So I was able, while I was there, at the very end of my year, I went in January, to start collecting local breadfruit varieties with a Samoan woman I work with and kind of figure out what it took to collect. And I wrote a letter to NTBG, the National Tropical Botanical Garden, and asked them if they wanted some material. So we figured out a way to send them. They said yes, they'd accept some materials. And so I needed to figure out, well, I'm here in Samoa. I'm going to be going back to Hawaii, to Honolulu. I've got to figure out a way to do this. And so I contacted the director of the garden, Dr. Theobald, and I wrote him a letter, and he never followed up. So my professor met with him and told him what I wanted to do, and Dr. Theobald, the director, gave me a grant of $3,000. And with that grant, I was able to begin my travels collecting breadfruit. And the garden had this commitment at that time to create a definitive collection of breadfruit and bread nut, because there are already breadfruit trees at Kahanu Garden. And so Dr. Theobald was thrilled that this, graduate student in Samoa was writing him and saying, hey, I'm in Samoa and I'll collect breadfruit for the garden if you'll give me a little bit of money. So off I went and traveled as many ways as I could. And every one of these slides could be a 20-minute story about what happened. But I went on big jets, when I could. Twin otters, 19-seater twin otters are like the workhorses of the Pacific. Went on little planes. I don't know if you can tell, but that one plane has a flat tire. It blew out when we landed because the plane was too full of taro that they were shipping. And you see me smiling in that plane with the flowers? I was terrified. Can you see? It's full of pineapples. After they loaded us, and the co-pilot was the 6-year-old son of the woman who chartered the plane. After they loaded us, they filled the plane with pineapples. And the night before, I had gone to drink with the pilot. I didn't drink it. The Busch beer, and the woman who chartered said, make sure he doesn't drink too much beer because he needs to be sober when he flies off Tonga tomorrow. But we made it, so that was good. But yeah, and I went by ship, and this was really fascinating because a lot of the islands, especially the little atolls in 1985, had no airstrips. And so I went from Samoa to Tokelau, 3 little atolls on the Kali, a freighter. Now, it was able to come into port in Apia, and you could go through the gangway. I don't say the gangplank, whatever you do to get on a ship. But when we came to the atolls, there are no docks. These are little atolls. So we climbed down rope ladders down the side of the freighter into these boats, which are loaded. And then you take that boat, and that little boat goes through a passage in the reef. And if you're lucky, those boats don't flip over in the surf. Mine did not. Some in our group did. And then at the end we went to 3 islands, and after our trip on one island, we had to walk, you can see, out to the edge of the reef and get in a boat, cross the reef on foot, get in a boat, and climb back up the side and come back. So that was my first collecting adventure, and it was really exciting and an adventure. And I still wanted to continue doing it. There's another kind of ship in the Pacific, the field trip ships. And they're combination passenger freighters. And same kind of thing, they don't really usually have docks when you land, so you get on these little boats again. But when we went to this island, it was a church group traveling, so they had a special field trip ship going, and I was able to go along. Everybody in this little island came out to greet us as we came ashore, and that's what's happening here. But I was able to get a cabin, but when I went in my cabin, there was a man in my cabin, and there were bunk beds, and he looked at me, and I looked at him, and he goes, this isn't going to work. So we went and talked to the captain, and the captain said, oh, I can't put this woman in your cabin, that's not right. So they put me in the infirmary, which was great because it was air conditioned, and I had my own bathroom. And so, but everyone else is out on deck, and hundreds of people. And then in some of the places we landed, you see the people dancing. The Rombi Islanders hosted me and my guide to a feast and traditional dancing. And it was just, so special. But it wasn't all interesting or fun or exciting. So I was on ferries for hours sometimes. My guide and I are fast asleep. I waited at one airport for hours with our team, and I finally just gave up and lay on one of the duffel bags. I had a ride, as you can see, with the ahi that I did have for dinner. But that top, can you read it from where you are? That telegram says, I can't read. I'll read it from here. Yeah. It's sent to John Abingdon, the Chief Research Officer in Honiara, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Please take note that Miss Diane Ragone's visit to Temotu province is banned for taking out samples which can be grown. Stop. This is in accordance with a resolution of the provincial government. So I had worked in Fiji, done my collecting. This was in 1987. I started on, so when I left Samoa and I did my first collecting expeditions, I went back to Hawaii. I had to find a place to live. I had to find funding in 1986 to continue my work. I had a few materials that had survived, and so I was able to get a grant of $30,000 to do field work, but the University of Hawaii wouldn't take it, so I called Dr. Theobald. I said, Dr. Theobald, I've got this grant proposal in, and I'm asking to do this, and this. He goes, well, how much are you asking for, and where are you going? I said, I'm asking for $18,000. I'm going here, here, and here. He goes, oh, ask for more money and go somewhere, and add somewhere in. And he goes, we'll manage the grant, and we will plant any breadfruit that you collect. And so I said, great. So I got the grant. And so I went to Fiji, and then I went to the Solomon Islands, and I was on Guadalcanal, and I was going to go out to the Temotu province, which is a very difficult and very challenging place to get to, but it's a breadfruit center. So I arrive in Honiara, and I'm banned from going to collect. But they sent me there on a government fishing boat with 3 guides, I guess to make sure I didn't collect anything. And I spent almost 2 weeks out in the Temotu province, but I couldn't collect any planting materials. And I work with local departments of agriculture and extension agents. And so I was collecting propagating material to grow plants and herbarium specimens and taking photographs. And so breadfruit's a very tall tree, so you can see in every one of these pictures a young man climbing the tree to collect the fruit, to collect the leaves. One young man on one island climbed 23 trees in one day. He wouldn't work with me the next day, but they wouldn't let me climb the trees. But I work with so many agriculture department people, and they were just so helpful and so interesting and so interested in me. Like, who is this young woman, and why is she here, and what's she doing? But breadfruit was so important to them. And so these are just some pictures of some of the people. One woman, Fa'anea Fu'alau, we're still friends. She was the first Samoan woman to get an undergraduate degree in agriculture in Samoa. And she and I went around, visited her and stayed with her family. And that's the first breadfruit tree and variety that I ever collected with Fa'anea's help. But just showing some samples of the men and the materials that they would bring back in, so then I could deal with drying and making the specimens and preparing them. So a lot of botanists go into the field and collect herbarium specimens, and then they dry it. But I'm collecting a living plant, so I'm collecting propagating material. I'm collecting a plant that doesn't produce seeds, so I had to dig up roots, and in some cases I had to do the digging. The guides helped me dig them up. They had to all be washed, scrubbed to remove any soil. I had the proper permits to collect the plants, and I had the USDA permits to bring the plants back into the country. That's why the roots look the way they do. And then I shipped them back into Hawaii. And they went to the University of Hawaii greenhouse, all of them. And they were grown in the greenhouse, and I did my PhD research on them. And then in 1989, I loaded up a van of breadfruit plants in Honolulu at the university, drove it to the Hawaii Department of Agriculture to be inspected, put it on a barge, a Young Brothers barge to Maui, flew to Kahului, rented a van, loaded them in the van, drove them to Hana, and I wish I had a picture of me in that van and those breadfruit trees going to Hana, and then Francis Lono and his gardeners and the team of interns helped plant the first trees in 1989 to add to the 30 trees that were already there in the collection. And then then I had a big interlude of 6 years when I was hired in '89 to set up and run the garden's native plant conservation program. And through this program and conservation and some of the dramas and traumas of a hurricane and director changes and other things, I didn't work on breadfruit at all. I took 2 more shipments of breadfruit to Kahanu Garden, and they were planted. And I went over about once a year to look at them and monitor them. But I was always fascinated by what I'd seen doing collecting the varieties. I was always fascinated by the people and the women and the cultural uses. What were people doing with breadfruit? And these were in the Solomon Islands. This woman and her daughter came walking by with the baskets of breadfruit on their heads, and they dry breadfruit in a really interesting way to preserve it and store it. And then these women in truck who make a pit fermented breadfruit. So in 1996, I started going back to the Pacific to extensively document these pretty rare and unusual and vanishing practices, traditional practices of conserving breadfruit, the use of the breadfruit, the real biocultural. So my first 2 years of field work was focusing on the varieties, to collect the varieties and the information. So I did still continue to collect varieties, but it was mainly focused on this information. And I didn't go alone. In my first 2 years of field work, I traveled alone. And when I started going back in the field in 1996, my husband, Jim Weisman, went with me, and he went with me on all my subsequent expeditions. And he was a professional photographer, as you can see with all the cameras, and videographer. I also was accompanied by 2 staff botanists, Dave Lawrence and Tim Flynn. And we did a lot of more botanical expeditions, collecting plants. And Dave Lawrence was my main field companion, and he is a wonderful person to go in the field. So if you ever have a chance to go in the field with Dave Lawrence, oh my gosh, he's the most incredible botanist. But you can see he always lends that helping hand. And so Dave was along on all my subsequent expeditions. And it was great. I was also able to have other people accompany me. So Professor Sir Ian Prance went on one expedition with me as my field assistant. That was pretty awesome. And Michael Balick, who received the Fairchild Medal a few years ago, he started doing field work in Micronesia, so did field work with him. And one of our trustees, Leslie Clark, went on a field expedition. That's her in the top right there. And then Kathy Richardson and Georgie Dukas and Tina Wilson, garden trustees. So from going into the field by myself for so many islands and so many months, to be able to go in the field with other people and teams of people really was an enriching and fun and productive. And I met and learned so much from so many people. I am so indebted to the Pacific Islanders who welcomed me into their homes, who put up with my crazy questions, who were patient with me, who didn't fall to the floor laughing most of the time about how I pronounced the variety names. They love my hearing their variety name and with my southern drawl, and just sharing information and knowledge with me. And sadly, so many of the people that I work with have passed away, and but they were shared so much of their information with me. And I was able not just to do the ethnobotanical documentation, I was able to do it, right? Get down and do something. So learning how to grate a coconut to make coconut milk, and kneading mashed preserved breadfruit. And so my field travels took me to 51 islands. And I was able, in some cases, I did go by canoe. I saw some of the most extraordinary breadfruit trees on the planet in their size and their health. I was able to meet so many wonderful people and see incredible sites in Micronesia like Nan Madol, which is one of the largest archaeological sites in the Pacific. And I amassed really a treasure trove and an awesome and a responsibility of information resources from my work. So photographic slides, my field notebooks, herbarium vouchers, the Breadfruit collection at Kahanu Garden, 150 varieties, which Mike Opgenorth and his staff and Noel Dickinson with the Breadfruit Institute are now managing and studying. And at tomorrow, my presentation tomorrow, I will speak more actually about the collection and the work that has been done on the collection for 30 years as far as research and documentation and conservation. So I'd like to wrap up to talk just a little bit about one of the outcomes of all this work, not only to collect and document and conserve traditional knowledge and varieties, is a way to give back. And it's, a global hunger initiative was launched through the guidance and direction of Douglas Kinney, who was a long-term trustee and supporter of not only NTBG, but the Breadfruit Institute and the work of the Institute. And the mission, the Global Hunger Initiative's goal was to distribute good quality varieties of breadfruit for food, reforestation, and economic development. And I just want to take the opportunity to thank Liz Kinney, who is here, and Doug Kinney. And that's Doug and I was one of the very first flats of breadfruit plugs here at the Kampong under the fig tree. And also Kent Wheatley and Judy Kern from the Ceres Trust. They were also tremendous supporters of the work, my work and the work of the Institute. And so plants have gone around the world, and they've gone to probably 50 countries through the work of the Institute directly and indirectly. The Trees That Feed Foundation, they're in the picture, Mary McLaughlin and their work, and projects in Haiti and Ghana and so many others. So and we've had projects where breadfruit varieties have gone back to the Pacific Islands as well. So it's gone full circle. It's not just an academic exercise, it's conserving traditional trees and varieties and knowledge, but also building a global resource that is so important. And with that, thank you all.